Bom dia a todos e todas. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Estudos Estratégicos e do Laboratório de Estudos sobre a Política Externa Brasileira, que são os organizadores desse evento. Nós estamos dando início hoje à 8ª edição do Simpósio Internacional de História Global das Relações Internacionais. E esse ano, o nosso tema são os impactos do 11 de setembro, 20 anos depois. Nós demos a esse evento o título de Ecos do 11 de setembro, o Brasil e o Mundo, 20 anos depois. Nesse nosso evento, ao longo dos próximos 4 dias, nós teremos 6 mesas, 2 conferências, com 21 palestrantes e 8 coordenadores de mesa, representando 22 instituições de 6 diferentes países. É um evento que, a cada ano, ele tem aumentado a sua magnitude e já tem se tornado uma referência para os estudiosos de história das relações internacionais e de história global. Eu queria dar início, eu queria fazer essa abertura agradecendo aos colegas que estiveram junto comigo na comissão organizadora, o professor Gabriel Passetti e o professor Roberto Mon, que está aqui. Agradecer aos servidores técnicos administrativos do INEST, o Tiago Cunha, o Igor Medina e o José Valadão, que estão dando o apoio logístico à realização desse evento. Agradecer ao colega Eduardo Heleno, professor Eduardo Heleno, que foi o responsável pela parte visual do simpósio, pela elaboração do site, pela elaboração do material de divulgação. E quero registrar que a realização desse evento, no contexto em que nós vivemos, no contexto que estamos vivendo, é de extrema importância. Não somente por causa dos impactos que todos nós estamos sentindo da pandemia do Covid-19, mas pelo fato do que nós temos assistido nos últimos tempos, que são constantes ataques à ciência, constantes ataques à universidade pública. A realização de um evento desse porte por uma universidade pública é mais uma prova que é essa instituição, a universidade pública, republicana, gratuita, que produz conhecimento científico nesse país. É essa instituição que produz reflexões críticas sobre a sociedade, sobre o mundo que nos cerca. E essa é a sua função precípua, essa é a sua função primordial. A realização desse evento, nesses tempos que nós vivemos, é mais um sinal da resistência da universidade, da ciência, aos ataques que nós temos sofrido nos últimos anos. Então, dou boas-vindas a todos e todas. Espero que nos próximos dias todos nós possamos aproveitar do evento, dos nossos palestrantes. Como eu disse, temos um grande número de palestrantes de diferentes instituições, com visões distintas, caracterizando esse evento como um espaço plural, democrático, de debates de ideias, e creio que vai ser proveitoso para todos nós. Então, boas-vindas a todos, bom evento para todos nós. E eu gostaria, então, de passar a palavra para o meu colega, professor Roberto Moll, representando todos os membros da comissão organizadora. E gostaria também, antes de passar a palavra para o Moll, de justificar a ausência nessa mesa de abertura do nosso diretor, professor Vágner Camilo, que por conta de uma emergência médica ele não pôde comparecer. Mas a direção do INEST, como sempre, desde a primeira edição do Simpósio Internacional de História Global e das Relações Internacionais, ainda à época, com o professor Eurico Figueiredo na direção, sempre nos deu todo o apoio, sempre nos deu todo o respaldo para a realização do nosso simpósio. Moll, lhe passo a palavra.
Bom dia a todos. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas em nome da comissão organizadora do evento, a comissão que tem, como o professor Adriano já falou, eu, professor Adriano e o professor Gabriel Passetti. É um prazer tê-los vocês aqui. Eu queria agradecer também o suporte dos servidores do PPGEST, do INEST, né? Sem eles, isso aqui não seria possível. A gente tem algumas facilidades nesse momento de pandemia ainda, de contar com professores de outros lugares. Isso para nós aqui, para o nosso evento hoje, é algo sensacional, né? A gente pode contar com professores aí da Austrália, Camarões, dos Estados Unidos, enfim, de diferentes países, né? De Portugal, de diferentes países, mas, por outro lado, esse novo modelo de organizar eventos pressupõe uma estrutura que antes não tínhamos, né? Que é justamente essa estrutura online, e que quem nos dá o suporte a essa estrutura sempre são os servidores do INEST, do PPGEST, o José Valadão e o Tiago Cunha. Então, eu gostaria muito de agradecer a eles. Gostaria de agradecer também a direção do INEST, né, como disse o Adriano, por sempre ter apoiado esse evento, do qual eu já estou, acho que na terceira vez, na parceria com o Adriano e com o Passetti, ajudando a organizar. Hoje, né, a gente inicia um evento sobre a nossa efeméride do 11 de setembro, né, os 20 anos dos atentados terroristas ao World Trade Center em Nova York, nos Estados Unidos. E acho que é um evento que, para a área de história, relações internacionais, de história das relações internacionais, é um evento definidor, a ponto de discutirmos se, na época, né, hoje em dia talvez essa discussão tenha ficado um pouco para trás, mas de discutirmos se era aquele momento o final de uma era, né, ou aonde era o final dessa era, se era ao final da Guerra Fria ou nos atentados de 11 de setembro. Eu diria que os atentados terroristas transformaram completamente a forma que as relações internacionais veem o mundo, inclusive, né, tiveram um impacto definidor do ponto de vista da teoria das relações internacionais e o impacto definidor para pessoas que fazem relações internacionais também, né? No dia 11 de setembro, talvez nossa plateia seja majoritariamente formada por pessoas que não haviam nascido naquele momento, mas tenho certeza que eu e o Adriano já estávamos por aqui, né? E eu estava no meu último ano do ensino médio. E os atentados de 11 de setembro foram definidores para o que eu queria fazer da minha vida, assim, a partir daquele momento, né? Tamanha foi a dimensão, obviamente, que ganhou na vida das pessoas de várias formas, né? Então, eu espero que a gente possa ter aqui um evento que contribua bastante para a gente ampliar, inclusive, a compreensão sobre os atentados de 11 de setembro, para além do Brasil, para além dos Estados Unidos, né, observando aí diferentes perspectivas e o que mudou no mundo após o 11 de setembro. Eu, mais uma vez, gostaria de desejar um bom evento a todos. A nossa palestra de abertura, né, a nossa conferência de abertura com o professor James Ketterer, vai começar daqui a 10, 15 minutinhos mais ou menos, às 10h45. O professor James Ketterer teve um pequeno contratempo, porque, curiosamente, já temos as questões de fuso horário, mas nos Estados Unidos o horário de verão terminou ontem, né? E quando eu marquei com ele a palestra, ele não tinha se dado conta disso e se confundiu um pouco com o horário, e aí a gente conversando, ele pediu para pelo menos começar às 10h45, e pediu 30 minutos aí de espera para ele poder se organizar. Mas às 10h45, então, voltaremos, faremos um pequeno intervalo, 10, 12 minutos, né, a partir de agora, e espero contar com todos vocês aqui.
Um aviso, antes de passar por esse pequeno intervalo, que as inscrições, nós vamos permanecer com o formulário aberto para aqueles que desejarem obter o certificado de participação até exatamente o início da palestra do professor James Ketterer. A partir do momento que a conferência se iniciar, as inscrições estarão encerradas. Portanto, aqueles que desejarem obter o certificado de participação deverão fazer a inscrição nos próximos minutos, né? Obrigado mais uma vez, um bom evento para todos nós.
Broadcast live now. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm fine. Good morning now. Welcome to the VIII Symposium on Global History and International Relations. Let's begin with our opening conference. I am pleased to introduce you Professor James Ketterer from American University in Cairo. James Ketterer is Dean of the School of Continuing Education. He previously served as Dean of International Studies at Bard College and Academic Director of the Bard Globalization and International Affairs Program, and taught in Bard's Political Studies and Global and International Studies Program. Ketterer previously served as Egypt Country Director for MEDist. Prior to that, he was Vice-Chancellor for Policy and Planning and Deputy Provost at the State University of New York, SUNY. At SUNY, he was the Director of the Center of International Development and Program Officer at the Center of Legislative Development. In government, he served on the staff of the New York Commission on Higher Education, the National Security Council staff at the White House, and as policy analyst at the New York State Senate. He worked on elections for United Nations, the African American Institute, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Africa and in Europe, and has carried out consultants for USA in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. He was a Bohr Fellow in Morocco and Rotary Ambassadorial Scholar in Tunisia. He serves on the board of the Swedish program at Stockholm School of Economics, the organizing committee of 2020 Transatlantic Dialogue at the University of Luxembourg, and a senior fellow at the Bard Center for Civic Engagement. And I need to add, Professor Ketterer is a wonderful jazz drummer. Professor Ketterer, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being here.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Is the technology working? Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you and to be with like-minded people to discuss these important issues. I wish we could be gathering in person. Unfortunately, the times don't allow that, but at the same time, this technology allows us to join together from across the globe. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to talk for a little bit about the topic at hand, and then I really do encourage questions and conversation, because I think the real value of these sorts of gatherings, in person or virtually, is the ideas that are formed as we discuss them and bring to the fore things that we could highlight as a group that aren't necessarily what I might highlight. So I really encourage wide-ranging, provocative questions. I think that's why we're all here. On the question of 9/11, given the way in which this was just recently, seen as the 20th anniversary, I think anyone who was watching the kind of retrospective as the 20th anniversary was marked, couldn't help but be reminded of that day, of course. And for any of us who are old enough, and I certainly am, to have been working or otherwise engaged in global activities of that day, that one is reminded of not only the kinds of broad issues of foreign policy and the conceptual issues in international relations, but also just the absolute shock of the moment, the shock to the people of New York. I myself am a New Yorker. The shock of also Washington and Pennsylvania, but the international system just kind of in a moment of amazement and fear and the violence of that day. There's much other violence to be discussed that followed, but that it was all, captured and was so immediately in people's faces via their computer screens, their television screens, or what have you. That's all kind of comes back with the retrospective of this 20th anniversary. And I think it's important to keep in mind, because for those of us who are interested in the study of foreign policy and international relations, we have a certain perspective on these things that I think allows us to put it into some broader intellectual framework, and to see it holistically, and as many of us do, to put it in the context of theory. That's all well and good. That's appropriate for what we do, and it's important. But it's also important for us to remind ourselves of how many other people would and continue to react to events like this, these sort of overarching cataclysmic events that appear to turn history on its head. Whether we agree with that assessment or not, the fact that many are perceiving it to be as such is important. And when the films are shown again 20 years later, and it brings to the fore those emotions, those fears, that sense of shock, that's important for us to keep in mind. Now, what I really want to talk about, though, also is everything that happened afterwards, the kinds of things that came to really mark this 20-year period, and to have 9/11 be seen as an ending point of that first phase of the post-Cold War era into a new phase where things really would take on a very different character. And then it's for us to decide, and perhaps to talk about today, what of those elements will continue on into the next 20 years and beyond, and what of them are kind of shorter term, medium term effects in the international system and for American foreign policy. I really look at the questions of American foreign policy myself, and I'm going to be doing so today, but I don't want this to be limited to a question of just the United States. So I really encourage people to bring in other examples, other cases, and other contestations from different perspectives. One of the things, of course, we can look back on, but it really is bears repeating, that was an immediate after effect of 9/11, was the George W. Bush administration decision to follow a course of unilateralism. That for all the talk about working with allies, for all of the post Cold War focus on NATO as an institution, and NATO will play a role in this, of course, but NATO as an institution that really would be perceived as working together as a unit, that this was largely cast aside in many ways, with with a direct focus on unilateralism, and with phrases like "you're either with us," us meaning the United States, or "you're against us." This binary view of a perception of the world. And then, as we could see in the run up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, a real bullying, uh, very aggressive approach toward allies, that allies would be seen as either being on board or as not. And that this is not really the way that it was perceived that NATO would operate when NATO was, continued on after the Cold War, that the United States was seen as obviously a dominant and important member, but that NATO would not be seen as a tool of United States foreign policy. And though NATO, in its immediate reaction to 9/11, in invoking the Mutual Defense Pact, Article 5, and all of those things, behaved as one would have expected as an alliance, in the few years following 9/11, what we really saw was this overarching American focus on unilateralism, on the use of force for regime change to fit the purposes of American foreign policy, and a demand that allies get in line. So, how did that really play out? Well, we could see, for instance, that certain governments, like France, as an example, in the run up to the invasion of Iraq, balked at this idea. They said, this is a mistake. This is a policy mistake. This is not an issue that we want to drag France into. The same with the Germans. And the American reaction was to stop answering their calls, was to see them as not on board with the program. And we see, as a second example, is the United Kingdom and the Blair government, which decided to support the Bush policy and Iraq, and decided to stay on board. And their decision was therefore, they're all in. That, behind closed doors, perhaps, we found out later that Tony Blair was trying to convince the United States of a track that would at least pull in the United Nations to a certain level, and at least pay some lip service to key alliances. But once on board with the program to go into Iraq, that meant that the United Kingdom was committed to this. And that commitment for the UK, has resulted in decades of, almost 2 decades now, of massive controversy over that decision. So it also highlights, I think, for the United States and for all of the members of NATO, that when the Cold War ended, there wasn't really the same sort of assessment as to the purpose of NATO and its purpose going forward post Cold War that it really needed to have. So, as it faced this major crisis of 9/11, then Afghanistan, then Iraq, it was torn in many different ways that really didn't happen in the Balkans in the late 90s. There were tensions within NATO, of course, but that was in Europe. It felt immediate. It felt like it needed immediate, particularly the Kosovo crisis. But these other cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, they were testing the alliance in ways that it hadn't been tested, and it became, I think, a much bigger test because the alliance was not really as solid a footing as it should be. What was the purpose of the alliance? How much should it expand? What should be its engagement with or not with Russia, etc.? These are questions that I think still haven't really been dealt with as deeply and as broadly, with a broader public and community engagement that needs to happen. They're still laying out there as things that need to be addressed more fully. I would just say, as an aside, in American elections, NATO has come up a bit, and it's more kind of American management of NATO and not the raison d'etre of NATO. So NATO, alliances, American unilateralism, these are things that are certainly hallmarks of the early days, the early years following 9/11. Um, Also, a major use of the American military in the conduct of foreign policy. And I would say a couple of things come to mind that I think are important to address if you're looking at the nature of the United States and how it has been affected more broadly and at greater length by 9/11. And one is something that a variety of commentators are concerned about, and that is an increasing civil military gap. By that, I mean a gap between those who serve in the military and the rest of the citizens. Those who serve in the military are a very small percentage. I believe it's now less than 1% of the population. The United States doesn't have obligatory military service anymore. That ended after Vietnam. And there's never been any really serious move politically to reinstate the military draft. So what this has meant with the U.S. and Afghanistan for 20 years, and with engagements in the Middle East and Iraq and other places for a long time, is that the burden of these military engagements was put on a small number of Americans who would not only go to fight in these places one time, but would be sent on multiple deployments. And a real sense that the American military went to war, but the American people, as they say, went to the mall, they went shopping, that they were completely disconnected from the purpose of the military. They were disconnected from the mission of what was at hand, and they were disconnected from the stakes at play, that who's doing the fighting, who's getting injured, who's doing the dying, who's paying the price. And that over time, over these post 9/11 decades, that this has created a serious gap between the people who serve in the military and those who don't. Not just one of different experiences, but a real disconnect in understanding what either side is doing, and a real concern that in the military, that they may have, in fact, not a hostility perhaps, but a disdain toward American society in general, seeing them as being disconnected and perhaps even ungrateful for what is being done from the military's perspective on their behalf. So that's one element that I think is an important thing to keep in mind, and it continues to sort of boil just below the surface. It's not a regular feature of the American political discourse, but I think you're starting to hear more and more of it, highlighted perhaps even a little bit more by the recent American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and one that was done in a way that appeared to be so clumsy and awkward, irrespective of what you might think about the policy to withdraw from Afghanistan, that the withdrawal itself was fairly disastrous, and that this, I think, has highlighted for many people in the military that many Americans who hadn't been paying attention to Afghanistan for the last 20 years were suddenly looking in on it and being critical and not fully understanding what people in the military do and what they have to go through in order to do it. Another element of this, massive emphasis on the role of the American military in foreign policy is what I would call the militarization of diplomacy. And by that I mean two things. One is that we have had in places like the Middle East and in Afghanistan, we've had mid-level officers on the ground engaged in what would otherwise be diplomatic or development activities. They would otherwise be the domain of diplomats in the State Department or development officials in the U.S. Agency for International Development. And so, as the military was really better suited to go into these situations that were quite dangerous, but yet at the same time required some level of diplomacy with local town councils, with provincial leaders, etc., that you had people who really weren't trained in development or diplomacy engaged in it. Another element of the militarization of diplomacy is having diplomats engaged sometimes in provincial teams or working more and more in combat zones or high conflict zones, and those experiences really shaping their view of what it means to be a diplomat. And so that even after they leave these combat zones or these conflict zones and they move on in their careers, as diplomats do every 3 years, moving on to the next place, that they take these combat experiences with them. And I don't mean in some sort of a psychological way, post-traumatic stress disorder, although that is a problem for many people who have served in these zones, but I mean just merely shaping the definition of what it means to be a diplomat and how to comport oneself, that also becomes an issue. And that is further exacerbated by a third element of the militarization of diplomacy, or in this case, maybe the securitization of diplomacy. And that is that many American embassies around the world are fortresses. And so one can understand that if you're serving in Baghdad or Kabul, that as an American diplomat, you're living in a highly secured compound and you don't get out and about much, and probably not at all. But the reality of serving in an embassy in many other places in the world now is that they are built as fortresses. Some of this, a good deal of it, is in the wake of 9/11. Another part of it is in the wake of the embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998, in Tanzania and Kenya, devastating bombings on those facilities. In those days, many American embassies were located in downtown locations in capital cities, and it was common, particularly for people engaged in public diplomacy, but also all other aspects of categories of diplomats, to be out and about and interacting with people in the society, as it would be appropriate by their own job titles. That's more and more difficult for American diplomats to do now. So they find themselves kind of replicating that experience. Maybe they're not in Baghdad anymore, but they're in some other embassy that makes it not quite as impossible to interact, but still difficult, that the security barriers are still there. Now, I have read just recently in the past 2 weeks that Secretary of State Blinken is working hard to mitigate these issues and to say we need diplomats to be out and about and making those contacts more. But it's difficult. It's easier said than done. No one wants to be the one who says, well, let's take down the security, or let's allow these things to be less stringent, and then something terrible happens. So we have built up over the past 20 years an enormous security apparatus around our diplomats and around many of our institutions in the State Department around the world, but also within the United States, institutions of many different sorts. The security apparatus, which is hard to take down and also has kind of a self-perpetuating business model. There are people making a serious amount of money based on the security apparatus, much of which is not run by the government, but is contracted out to private contractors. And that leads me to another element that I think is an important hallmark of the post 9/11 American engagement with the world. And that is not just the fact that the United States went to war in various places, but the way in which it went to war. And what I mean by that is that there is an increased reliance on private military contractors and contractors of all sorts that flooded into these post-invasion zones. Contractors that were making quite a deal of money, but also were not beholden to the chain of command, whether it's the military chain of command or the diplomatic chain of command, in the same way that they would be if these were people working for the military or for the State Department or for USAID. And so I think this is an area that it certainly has been studied, and people have done good analysis of it. But it's a story that is going to inspire many, many more books, many, many more dissertations, and it's been a real change in the nature, in the ways in which the United States goes to war. Another element that I think is important is the decision-making process about going to war. Now, this is something that was already a major issue internally in the United States before 9/11 happened, but it was certainly brought into stark relief. It was highlighted as a problem by the engagements in Afghanistan, by the engagements in Iraq, but also in looking at the ways in which American force has been used in different ways in Yemen, with drones, in Libya with different aspects of engagement with NATO and the French, the failure to engage in many ways in Syria. And that is a key thing for anyone who has really seriously studied the United States Constitution, you would know that the American Congress plays a central role in declaring war. And the last time that Congress declared war was in December of 1941, after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. That's the last time that the American Congress declared war. Of course, that's not the last time that the United States has been involved in military conflict. And so, what is the difference between December 1941 and the rest of those cases is that there has been a long ceding of congressional power in the decision-making process about whether or not the United States should engage in military activity or not. And this is really this is something that people who have served in Congress are concerned about. It's something that people who have served in the military are concerned about. But the ways in which to fix it are really devilishly difficult, because you would be asking Congress to re-engage on a topic that is politically oftentimes very toxic for them. They would prefer to leave this to the decision-making capacity of the executive, of the president, and not have to make the really full final decision of war or not war. And so there has been lots of kind of intermediary definitions, and there have been broadly defined blank checks written to both truly checks in terms of funding, but also an authorization. So the authorization for the use of military force by the Congress following 9/11 has been used to do many, many, many other things that were not anticipated in those immediate days after 9/11. And it has also been seen as a great kind of giving up of power, ceding of power by the U.S. Congress to the executive, and in many cases, by some critics, seen as a way in which power has been abused, and that the Congress needs to not only rethink and re-engage its decision-making power on things like use of armed military conflict, but also to re-engage its other key element of any viable legislative body, which is oversight. What has happened, who's done what's working, what's not working, who's accountable, all of these things that are hallmarks of any legislative body when it's operating properly, whether it's on budget issues, military issues, any other sort of issue. And I think that this is another, key thing that has happened since 9/11. There have also been other kinds of issues that we can certainly see the results of. One is the question of immigration and the role of people who, the people who carried out 9/11 had gotten into this country, gotten in legally, by the way, under the rules of the time, and were able to plan and carry out this attack from within the United States. And the question of immigration has been a difficult one for a very long time, and one that has really been vexing for both of the major American parties. But then, when the element of 9/11 and the injection of fear into the system was added, that it really is almost kind of a logical conclusion that we would then see candidates and eventually presidents like Donald Trump, who would be seen as being very aggressively anti-immigrant. Very early on in the Trump administration, issuing an executive order that was called the Muslim ban, was taking certain categories of people from certain countries and saying that they would not be allowed to enter the United States. This led to not only a great backlash and lots of court cases, but continues on as an issue on how to manage immigration as a serious issue at every level. And it's not just a level in Washington. We're also seeing that states and communities are having to deal with this. But looking past the Trump administration, we see that the Biden administration is also finding this to be a deeply troubling issue, troubling not only on the policy grounds and how do you get it right, how do you manage the situation right, in this case, particularly along the southern border of the United States, but how do you manage it politically? We just had an election last week in the United States, an off off-term election and local elections and gubernatorial races and mayors, and the Republicans did quite well. And it's pretty clear from the polling data that this immigration issue continues to be front and center on people's minds. And as I said, it was on the policy desk for a long time, but 9/11 has really made it a major political issue with the broader public. Another issue I think that is that was brought to the fore by the Trump administration, but still is being sorted out now by the Biden administration, and that is this question of, it was known as America First during the Trump administration, but what really is going to be the proper role of the United States? Is it going to pull back? Is Afghanistan part and parcel of a broader strategy to lessen the American reach around the world and the American military footprint? Or is that just one case to say, well, that's not, we can't come to a proper conclusion, we can't come to a victory in Afghanistan, so we're going to pull out of that, but we're not going to change the perception and the reality of American presence around the world otherwise? Or is there a real interest in the way that Donald Trump highlighted for many people to say, well, why do we have troops in Okinawa? Why do we have troops in Korea? Why do we have so many troops in Europe, especially when NATO is not, the other NATO members are not paying their fair share? And I would say, by the way, that President Trump was not the only president who had complained about that. President Obama was quite vocal about it. He said it in perhaps a different way and a different style, but this has been an ongoing issue, and it's wrapped up in, from the Washington perspective, in this question of, well, what should really be the American commitment to many other places, and how many troops should we have stationed in these many other places? And there's I think a sense that the Trump leaning toward a more of a pullback was still a logical conclusion from his base of supporters from to 9/11 and to the ripple effects of 9/11. Let's say another area that is important to keep in mind, and I throw this out there for further discussion as I wrap up in a few minutes, and that is the sense that New York City, but other cities also, Los Angeles, other major American cities had, but New York is a very interesting case. How New York City reacted to 9/11 happening afterwards. In many ways, New York government and the citizens of New York, the residents of New York, not citizens, the residents of New York, felt in a way that they had been let down by the federal government. That 9/11, that all the elements of it were in effect in one way or another, known ahead of time. The dots weren't connected. It wasn't stopped. This huge apparatus of the FBI and the CIA and the National Security Agency and all of these national security components of the federal government, with all the resources that they have to bring to bear, were not able to stop this handful of men on airplanes with box cutters. And so cities like New York said, well, to a certain extent, we're on our own. The US Constitution clearly gives the defense of the country and the foreign policy, that is the bailiwick of the federal government, of Washington. But we see in the post 9/11 days a pulling of some of that power informally, not done by change in statute, but done by change in practice. So a de facto change that some of these cities that themselves have great resources and great global reach would start to take on some of these tasks themselves. For instance, the New York City Police Department started to have people in their intelligence units stationed in key parts of the world, outside of New York and outside of the United States. In theory, working, of course, with federal agencies and working with local partners. But the fact that the city did this and did it at a fairly noteworthy level is very interesting. Questions of immigration also were more and more seen as not just the function of Washington and the federal government, but also a function of a locality, a huge locality like the city of New York, one that has been largely dependent on immigration as a way to replenish talent, as a way to bring in new workforce, and as a source of political controversy. Every wave of immigrants throughout the history of the city of New York has also brought controversy as well as benefit. But managing these controversies and benefits and flows and all of this were more and more being seen as a local function, even though technically it was still a federal function. And though it had existed before, post 9/11, we also saw in the US urban areas and state governments reaching out to the rest of the world for their own trade policies, specifically trade promotion and the garnering, the attraction of foreign direct investment. And in my state of New York, this is a major component of what New York state government does as it reaches around the world and setting up offices in key parts of the world and seeking to do this. So we see these functions that were traditionally US government functions, then in one way or another, through this informal process post 9/11, becoming local functions. But that these localities are so big and so affluent and have so many resources that in some ways, not in ways that, would give them a flag at the United Nations, but in other de facto ways, behaving almost as quasi states. The last couple of things I want to just say, and then I want to turn it over to hear more from you, has to do with technology and the advancement of technology. And we could see, moving from the Bush administration into the Obama administration, an increased reliance on the use of drones, and the way in which drones would then really test the contours of American law as it relates to the use of force. Um, and and Yemen, I think, is an important case study during the Obama administration because force was used against American citizens in a way that blurred the line between conflict as war and use of force as a targeted assassination, depending on where one stood on that side of the debate. And these kinds of things, really were very problematic for the Obama administration that was seeking in a way to pull back from the boots on the ground traditional form of military engagement, but at the same time still meet military goals in a heavy conflict zone. And so use of drones was one thing. Surveillance society and the Snowden revelation coming to the fore during Obama, also was a real test of his administration, but also a test of American constitutional law and the American public's understanding of the role not only of government but of private entities like social media companies, but also major communications companies in turning over information to the government as part of this, ramping up of surveillance capacity, nominally to thwart any future 9/11 attack, but seen by many really as a massive overreach, invading the privacy of private citizens in a way that they had really not felt that they had been given a say in. So these questions of technology, whether it's being able to design drones that are so efficient that they can be flown by somebody who is somewhere sitting in an office building in somewhere in the middle of the United States, and the drone is hovering over some potential suspects, suspected of whatever it is they're suspected of at the moment in Yemen, and that someone can literally pull the trigger, can order the missiles to be fired from those drones as they're sitting in the Midwest of the United States and kill those people on the ground in Yemen. That this is one issue, and then this massive casting of a wide net of surveillance and the role that it plays in changing the relationship between government and citizens and the sense of privacy that citizens have against their own government, really being undermined and changed. The last thing I want to say as I wrap up is just to talk about my own region of the Middle East, of my own region. I work at the American University in Cairo. And then in the post 9/11 years, we've also seen, really major developments in the Middle East as they relate to American foreign policy. The Arab Spring, the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, and then uprisings in other places, really put the United States, the Obama administration in this case again, in an uncomfortable zone of trying to figure out, well, what former authoritarian regimes would it continue to support? In what case would it try to be on the quote unquote right side of history and support the revolutionaries in the street who were seeking change, and how to manage American foreign policy through these complexities. And we can see that Tunisia has had a very different outcome than Egypt, and then we have other states that really were extremely violent moments, and maybe extended moments, massive conflicts: Libya, Yemen, Syria, and we see a very kind of schizophrenic American approach with a military engagement in Libya, and ultimately regime change, which was really different than what the U.S. and the French had said was going to happen at the beginning. As I said, use of technology, drone strikes, conflict, but from afar in Yemen, and in Syria, a real concern that it could turn into another Libya sort of debacle, and a reluctance to get involved. Israel, Palestine, continuing on as perhaps a worsening situation, and one that is certainly not being resolved. And then the monarchies of the region finding ways to really largely avoid the downside risks of the Arab Spring and regime change. And we can see during the Trump administration that several of these monarchies being involved in the so-called Abraham Accords and being kind of brought into the fold, and a sort of an embrace of the stability and, in many cases, the resources available through these monarchies. So I think partially because it's my part of the world, and I'm paying close attention to it, but also I think intellectually the Middle East is an interesting case of the schizophrenic nature of American foreign policy following 9/11. Everything from the fiasco of Iraq to to these major events of the Arab Spring, to the Abraham Accords, to the failure to find a deal with the Israel-Palestine issue. It is an ongoing case. So with that, what I've tried to do is lay out a few areas of I think important things to look at, changes, some of them short-term, some of them medium-term, and some of them perhaps really long-term structural changes that not only affect the United States, but in fact the whole international system. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to some of you and see if we can chat about some of these issues.
Thank you, James. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to encourage our audience to do some questions, and don't be shy. I have two questions, in fact.
Yes, please.
I have two questions. You know that in Latin America, in some countries in Latin America, there's a big debate about the end of U.S. hegemony. Do you think that the 9/11 attacks and the aftermath somehow represents a fracture in U.S. hegemony? And one more question, and do you consider a paradoxical relationship between the September 11 attacks and the erosion of democracy in the U.S. and the world? We'll show some questions in the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, but let me
Okay.
let me take those on, because they're both truly excellent questions. On I guess I'd answer the question about hegemony in the following way, and that has to do with another gap that I think has really developed in American foreign policy over the past 20 years, is what I would call the gap between aspirations, sort of hoped for goals, and true capacity. The capacity to really do things, to get stuff done on the ground. So not just sitting around and talking about it in a think tank in Washington or at a diplomatic meeting in Geneva or in the United Nations, but really getting stuff done. And what we can see is that American capacity appears to be out of sync with American aspirations. And I think we could see that no more starkly than Afghanistan. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan, not only in the immediate term, was a disaster, but the entire engagement over 20 years was an example of this lack of capacity to meet aspirations, certainly in Iraq, certainly in Libya. I think you could make that argument in kind of a reverse way by kind of not doing something in Syria. I think we could probably find many other examples of this. So I think that, to your point about hegemony, I think that there still is very much a mindset in Washington in what Ben Rhodes called the blob, this kind of permanent encampment of foreign policy professionals in Washington from both parties, that they are fully on board with this assumption of American hegemony. But it seems impervious to the actual reality as it's played out in the world, and the lack of American capacity. I'll give you even a much more, perhaps I don't want to call it mundane, but less dramatic national security issue, and that is in the area of international education. It used to be the case that the United States was by far the preferred destination for good students anywhere in the world who were thinking of studying outside their country. We now see the numbers over the last several years of international students coming to the US consistently going down. And so the capacity, this is not a question of our government, but of sometimes our institutions, of American society, and the government's role in it as well, to attract these students is lessening, and the competition is increasing. And so, yet, I can tell you from within American academia, there is a lack of understanding that this may in fact be a permanent trend. So whether it's in militarization, diplomacy or international education and public diplomacy, I think we see this aspiration capacity gap. On the question of 9/11 and the sort of receding of democracy globally, there's been some interesting writing lately about the sort of through line between 9/11 and January 6th storming of the U.S. Capitol. And, are these really disconnected events? And if we see the January 6th storming of the U.S. Capitol as a dramatic embodiment of this disintegration of democratic norms and institutions, that okay, well, if we go backwards, what might be the link to 9/11? And I think we go back to these many other things that, lack of capacity of government, questions of immigration, the injection of fear into the system, the rising of populist politicians who are able to use that fear to their own ends. I think one could, and there are people who are making that argument very strongly. I think it's each place in the world is its own case, but I think we certainly can see trends that bring together many different places that have had this disintegration of democratic norms and institutions. How each of them tracks back to 9/11, I would have to think about that more. I'm not quite so sure, but I think it's more starkly evident of the United States because that's the country that was attacked on that day.
Thank you, James. We have one more question from the audience, Aline. Understand immigration on the southern border as a national security issue is tied to 9/11 or migratory flow on the southern border has always been a matter of national security. I think she's trying to ask if we have a connection between the crisis of immigration and the 9/11 attacks, and how the U.S. Managed this crisis of immigration after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because it really highlights one of the issues of massive polarization in the United States right now. So we have largely on the Republican side, not entirely, but largely on the Republican side, we have the positioning of this question of immigration on the southern border in particular, but also more broadly from the Muslim world, separate from the southern border, as a security issue. That this is a security issue, both in terms of countering terrorism, but also a security issue because the southern border could be letting in criminals, could be letting in people with diseases, etc. On the other side of the political debate in the United States, however, largely Democratic, is the idea that this is a humanitarian issue, that this is not a security issue, that the incidence of crimes, the incidence of terrorism, as it relates to people crossing the border is actually, in fact, very low, that we see people, number one, seeking asylum, and that we are bound by international treaties that we are signatory to and to convention to be able to give people at least a fair hearing toward deciding whether they deserve asylum or not. And we have people who are economic migrants who have very good life reasons to be coming across the border. And by the way, could be very good for the US economy, which in certain sectors is heavily dependent on economic migrants. These are two very different views of the same phenomenon. And if we go down the list of kind of hot political issues in the United States, we could see this same sort of polarization on almost probably every one of those issues. And that's no more the case than with this southern border issue. Is it a national security issue? Is it not? Is it a human rights issue? Is it not? Is it an international treaty issue? Is it not? Is it good for the economy or is it not? And the answer to that is so divisive, so polarized that it really is an insight into the state of American politics right now. So that's an outstanding question. How to solve that? I have no idea. That's a bigger question. But the way that it plays out and the way that it's positioned in American politics is an important insight into the nature of the political discourse right now.
Thank you, James. I think that our audience is very shy, and I have one more question. In fact,
yes,
I'd like to project the Biden administration and how the Biden administration will manage the terrorism topics on terrorism or Middle East politics, or even the pivot to Asia politics that Obama made in her government. His government.
Yeah. Well, this is another area where we see a real split. But the split for Biden, I think that's most important for him to govern on those kinds of national security issues, is a split within his own party, and that he is really working. You could see this on any number of political issues that he has before him, but it's true of national security as well. He has people who are very much in his administration who come from the left wing of the Democratic Party, and he has others who come from the kind of traditional centrist national security wing that wouldn't be that different than the old version of the Republican Party. And so within, on any given debate, let's say on, how important is human rights going to be in the conduct of American foreign policy? How important should human rights be as a litmus test as to whether Egypt should get its next installment of military assistance? That Egypt gets $1.5 billion a year of United States military assistance. Much of that has to be done only in the case that the U.S. could agree that Egypt is meeting up to human rights standards. And there are those in the Biden administration who say it's not, and they shouldn't get the money, and others who say it is enough. They're making progress, and they're a crucially important ally. And basically, from a realpolitik view of the world, we should be working closely with the Egyptians. Yes, we can work on human rights issues, but that's kind of a parallel and perhaps even ancillary track. And that the most important thing is that Egypt is a bulwark of American geostrategic policy in the center of the Middle East. So you see these two really distinct voices on just that one issue are diametrically opposed. And you play that out across many, many other issues on the use of force, on the use of surveillance, on the use of drones, on how aggressive counterterrorism policy should be, on all of this. He has a very, very difficult balancing act within his own party.
We have one more question from the audience. Pedro Luis, how did 9/11 affect the transatlantic partnership between America and its European partnership? And how do you evaluate the European engagement in the war on terror?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've been involved in over the past few years is something called the Transatlantic Dialogue, and centered in Luxembourg, but and Luxembourg is a very interesting kind of small state as a convener of very important issues. And the Transatlantic Dialogue, the last one I went to pre-COVID was, unfortunately, the most recent one was canceled because of COVID, but it brings together diplomats, scholars, artists, all sorts of people. It's a very different gathering than most that would have each of those groups of people in separate categories. And, not surprisingly, the state of transatlantic relations has not been fantastic, not really a high point. On a variety, some of it's stylistic, some of it's policy, and some of it is tensions, as I was just mentioning, tensions within the U.S. and real polarization. We see tensions and polarization on the continent of Europe, with different states or within different societies having massively different views on these hot button issues. The support of NATO, the role of immigration, the role of borders, in how strong should the EU be versus the nation state. how much should countries contribute to NATO? All of these things, we see a wide variety of answers to those questions, even within Europe. So it's hard to talk about kind of Europe as a single entity, where even France has elections coming up next year, and already it's heating up, and we can see, that the candidate who's going to represent the right might, in fact, be quite formidable, maybe even more formidable than Le Pen has been in the past. And it's on those issues that we were just sort of talking about. So, I think the state of relations has been difficult because the state of each side of them has also been enmeshed in their own massive, in often cases, paralyzing debate. I think, the question as it relates to kind of security, military issues, if you just look at the case of Turkey as a NATO member, highly problematic now. It's a key kind of bulwark NATO member, but at the same time, they're doing arms deals with the Russians. They're playing often a counterproductive role in Syria and other parts of the Middle East, counterproductive from an American or broader NATO perspective. Turkish immigration to other parts of Europe that has created over decades, and now even more recently, such an immigration backlash and anti-Muslim backlash. Turkey, I think, represents a really important case, and so if we think of Turkey as part of this broader European mix, we can see the kind of the diversity and the polarization and the real policy quandaries that it creates for all of those other kind of major players in North America and in Europe. That having been said, I do think that the Biden administration they're trying very hard to mend relations, but we can also see that they made a major misstep in dealing with the Australians on this submarine issue, and then creating a backlash from the French government. So, sort of one step forward, two steps back kind of feel with the U.S. European relations.
Well, James, thank you again so much for your talk and your time. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful talk. And if you want to say some finish words to our audience, feel free, please.
Well, I want to just thank you for the questions, including from you, Roberto. I mean, these are questions that, number one, highlighted things that I should have discussed in my talk, and so I appreciate that. But also, this is, as I said, an important part of the ongoing dialogue about these sorts of issues. I'm always worried, especially in the United States, how little international relations and foreign policy is discussed as part of taking on huge and important issues. And so I just want to applaud everybody for being involved in this conference, for doing that, and encourage you to not only continue to do it, but find ways to do it not just within the academy, not just in the university, but find as many opportunities as you can to engage, not to talk about international relations theory or something in the cafe that might bore people and put them to sleep. We wouldn't be put to sleep, of course, but others would. But to really try to engage people, go out and do public talks, go out and talk to high school students, talk in the media, write op-eds, do whatever you can to kind of engage people, no matter what your opinion is on it. I think it's important to just remind people of the importance of these sorts of things. And I worry that 9/11 is a good thing to focus on now because it was seen as such a kind of cataclysmic event. But I'm generally an optimist as a person, but the analyst in me always realizes that we're just always one moment away from another cataclysmic event of one sort or another, whether it's terrorism or climate change or who knows what, or a pandemic that we're living through now that I at least certainly didn't anticipate in the way that I should have. And so I think that the only antidote to that is to keep people engaged and thinking and understanding the importance of it. So there's a great audience of people here who are well positioned to do that, and I urge everyone to find ways in your own way to do it.
Thank you. This is our goal here, and we have. I'm pleased to tell this we have 300 people subscribed in this event, and so it's wonderful.
Well, it's wonderful, and
all.
my honor to be among you today, to be with a like-minded group of people, and I really appreciate it, and I'm just thrilled.
Thank you all. We'll be back at 2 p.m. with our first panel in Portuguese this time. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much.